All right, so thanks for coming, everyone. We're going to be talking about custom RBAC, as it says there, and can I do that? So my name is Matthew Edmonds. I work at IBM on a product called PowerVC that uses OpenStack, several OpenStack services, and so we have created several custom roles and tweaked some of the existing roles, so have some experience with this. And then this is Lance.
Yep, so I'm an engineer at Huawei. I work on Keystone and kind of some of the cross-project platform issues that come with that, and RBAC is a big pain point there. So today we're going to talk about customizing RBAC and some of the things that go along with doing that. So a quick look at our schedule. We're going to start with a quick introduction into RBAC and kind of level set on some terminology. Then we're going to go into a brief description of RBAC and how it's implemented in OpenStack specifically. And then I'm going to hand it over to Matt to talk about the complicated stuff, which is what happens when you customize things, what breaks, what things you need to know about, and then how you can remediate some of those issues. Then we'll wrap up with a quick look at what we're working on today that will hopefully make this a lot easier in the future. So what is RBAC? RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control, and it's essentially a way of controlling access to things based on users' role assignments. It's typically compared to other access control mechanisms like ABAC, for example, which is attribute-based access control. But it's easier to see the difference in the two when you compare them in an example. So an example ABAC policy might be a user with an attribute called manager can view sensitive data, right? Translating that to an RBAC policy might sound like a user with a role called manager can view sensitive data. And going a little deeper than just the description, what RBAC really gives you is a way to attach permissions to reusable things called roles. The permission or operation in the example that I just talked about is the viewing of sensitive information. That's the thing that we want to protect. The thing that we're attaching it to is called a role, and that role is called manager in this example. So beyond that, you can start granting that role to users or sets of users called groups, depending on the system that you're using. Then, when that user goes to access that data, some sort of policy enforcement engine or policy protection point is responsible for comparing that user making the request, the roles that they have, to the context of the request itself. And it's responsible for some sort of yay or nay on whether or not that user can actually make that request. And this is a very high-level overview of RBAC, but let's take a little bit more specific look at it from an OpenStack perspective, but following the same three basic steps. So attaching permissions to roles. If you're an operator or a deployer, this is going to be a familiar process to you. The first thing you're going to need to do is actually create the role, right? Next, you're going to kind of see something like this, which you might find in a policy.yaml file or a policy.json file. And what you're looking at on the left is the actual permission that we're protecting, and on the right is the role that we're protecting it with. From there, well, this is another representation of how you can do that, but it's done in code. This is something that we're kind of moving to across the board. The name of the actual documented rule default is the thing that we're protecting, and the check string is the role that we're protecting it with, along with some metadata information about the specific API that we're protecting. So then assigning that role to users. This is a very straightforward step, and it's typically done in Keystone, either via the CLI or the REST API itself. But this is also where OpenStack starts to deviate from traditional RBAC, and you can specifically see that on the second line of this command. Traditional RBAC would be focused on giving Alice the manager role, period. Here, we're actually giving Alice the manager role on a very specific scope called the development project. This is sometimes unofficially referred to as scoped RBAC, which is how we kind of use it within OpenStack, and it's kind of a deviation from traditional RBAC itself. So then in order for Alice to do anything useful, she kind of needs to get a token which carries that context and then give that to a service in order to create an instance or view sensitive data if we were to go back to the RBAC example that we talked about at the beginning. That token is going to be carrying Alice's role assignments on various projects and ultimately her scope. Then that token information is going to be compared within the context of the request. Again, this is a super high-level overview of RBAC, specifically within OpenStack, but it kind of lays the groundwork for some of the stuff that Matt's going to talk about and what happens when you start customizing this. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to him to kind of get into how you go about doing that.
All right. Thanks, Lance. So we're going to talk about customizing RBAC in several different areas. The first we're going to start out with is actually where do you find these policy settings that Lance referred to. So usually they're in the etc service policy JSON file. So that could be etc Nova, for Nova, etc Cinder, et cetera. They are also sometimes in YAML files instead of JSON files. This is something that we added support for within the last few releases. And the advantage to YAML, it's a superset of JSON. So your JSON file, you could just rename it a YAML file and it would work just fine. But you can also add comments in YAML files, which can be extremely useful if you're customizing policy, because you could make a comment of what was I thinking when I changed this line, so that you can come back and it can jog your memory later. So that can be very useful. The other thing here, you'll see there's two different conf options. So in the config file for Nova, let's say, if you're talking about Nova, you could add in the Oslo policy section policy file to change the name of the policy file that it's going to use. So instead of policy.json, you could change that to policy.yaml, or you could call it Bob if you wanted to. And then policy DIRs, this is where you can actually specify a set of directories that it should look for policy files in. So if you wanted to, for some reason, split your policy file into multiple policy files, you could do that. And it would check for those policy files in each of these directories. The other thing that Lance showed with the documented rule default in code, where we're trying to move defaults into code, and this has been done for Nova now and Keystone as of Pike. And there's a cross-project goal to do that for all the projects in Queens that we've been making some good progress on. Once the rules are actually have defaults defined in the code, that's where these CLIs come into play. So rather than you having to dig through the code, well, now they're in code, they're not in my policy file, how do I know what I actually am using? If you haven't customized anything as your starting point, you can use that first CLI command, and it will generate a policy.yaml file, or policy-sample.yaml in this case, that will pull all those defaults and create comments too based on description information that's also recorded in the code, and create that file for you so that you can then see it all in one place instead of having to dig through multiple locations in the code. Everything will be commented by default, so you could drop that in your directory and nothing would actually change, and then you can go through and uncomment something, tweak it a little bit as you see fit. The second command is similar, but it will take the defaults that are in code and then merge them with any overrides that you may have in a policy.json, policy.yaml file that you have set up. And so if you have started customizing things already, but usually you probably don't want to have this whole file with all the comments and everything for the stuff that you're not customizing actually sitting there in your deployment. You just probably want to keep that file minimalistic, limited down to exactly what you're overriding. But then you want to see, well, what's my full set of thing? At some point, you can run this command and generate that. Next thing is actually what's the syntax like for these policy rules? So the example that Lance showed earlier, there was the check string was on the right side of things. You've got the actual rule name, such as identity, create service. And then on the right, you had the rule that said, role admin. In this slide, what we're talking about is that part that's on the right. What is the actual rule what's that check string? If you put in the bang, the exclamation point, that means that it's not going to allow anybody to do that. So even an admin would not be able to do that anymore. So if you've got certain things that you want to turn off, that could be useful. Then the next two, you'll see both of those actually refer to, say that they work for any. So the @ symbol and the empty string, either one of those, and you'll see different ones of these in the default policies for different projects, either one of those means that anybody can do this. Now, you still obviously have to be able to get a token, and to get a token, you have to have some role on the project. But any role on the project would be sufficient for those operations. And then the last here is a little bit more complicated. But what that's doing is it's taking something from the context, which is basically think of that as your token. When you get a token, it's going to have some role information, your user ID, the project ID, maybe the domain ID for the project. That kind of information will be associated with your context from the token. And then it's going to try to match that against some attributes from the target. So let's say I wanted to check that the user ID that is that is actually logged in here with the token matches the user ID that created a virtual machine. That I could put a user ID over here, and then I could refer to the user from the target over there, and it would try to match those and before it would allow it to continue. So then this is fairly simple. You can group, you can use NOT operations, logical ands and ors. So this would allow you to create a little bit more complex rules where you could actually check multiple things within a rule, like role member or role something else, for instance. Now, how do you actually choose what role you want to customize? So we're going to talk about some of the roles that exist by default, and then what you might want to do in addition to that. So the first role is admin. You're always going to have an admin role because, as Lance pointed out, most of the time you have to actually run some kind of command or call an API to create a role. That would typically be true, except with Keystone, where you have to kind of bootstrap Keystone to have, to get it running in the first place. And so when you run the Keystone manage bootstrap CLI to actually bootstrap Keystone, it's going to make sure you have an admin role to begin with. So it's a very high-level role. It can do essentially everything, even some things that it shouldn't be able to. We'll get to that in a second. So there are a few issues with the admin role. The first is that in some projects, at least, there are hard-coded checks associated with the admin role. This becomes a problem where if you want to customize, you create a new role that can do some of the things that are normally limited to an admin. You may not be able to do that because you may run into a case where there are actually some hard-coded checks in the code that say it has to be admin. So that's one issue. Another is that it can operate outside of its assigned scope. So as Lance mentioned, when you assign a role to somebody, you also say they have that role on this project or on this domain. And when you do that, you would expect that if I gave them an admin role in project A, they can only do things in project A. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a famous bug that's been open for like 5 years, I think, 968696. The only bug you'll ever hear referred to by number in OpenStack, that I'm aware of anyway. But it says that the admin role can do things outside of their scope. So even though I'm not admin on project B, I'm only admin on project A, I can still list the VMs in project B. I can even update them. I can even delete them. I can't create things, oddly enough, in those other projects, but I can do everything else pretty much. So that's obviously a significant issue. You have to be very careful with who you give admin role assignments to. The next role we'll talk about is member. You'll notice that there's 2 members here. And that's because there isn't actually a member role. There is a default in the comp setting, not in policy, in comp for Keystone that refers to a member role with the underscores. And then there's a default in Horizon that refers to member with the capital M. But there is no actual reference to this in the policy files themselves. So you could name it whatever you want, and it will be able to do everything else, pretty much. If you can't do it as an admin, you'll be able to do it as a member. Because it's implemented as a catch-all. So I talked about the empty string, and that meaning that anybody can do this. That's how member is implemented in the policy files. You'll never see a policy file that actually refers to a member role, at least not by default. So that actually becomes problematic if I want to customize this. So I want to create a new role. Well, any new role that I create is going to be member. So I could create 3 different new roles, custom roles, in addition to maybe I created a member role. All of them are going to be able to do everything that member can do as well. So if you wanted them to be a subset of that, sorry, you'll have to actually customize a lot of policy lines to make that happen. There's a few other roles that are there by default in some respect. The Keystone policy file refers to a service role, and the only thing it allows it to do is validate tokens. So this should be used much more than I actually have seen it used, where if you, in your Keystone auth token section of the config file for Novo or Cinder, et cetera, what that's used for is it tells those services when a request comes in, how do they actually go talk to Keystone to validate the token. The credentials that you put in that section, ideally, would have the service role associated with that user, and that's all they would be able to do. And then reseller admin is a role that is defined in Swift's conf, and I don't actually remember off the top of my head what that does, but that's another role that, that you may run into. There are issues with this. As I said before, any role that you create is going to be member unless you customize things otherwise. So that's going to apply to both of these. So you might think that you've given the service role to somebody. They're only going to be able to validate tokens, and that's it. That's not true. They'll also be able to create VMs and everything else that member can do. The reseller admin also has the additional problem that the permissions for that are hard-coded in Swift. So I told you I don't remember exactly what it does, but I do remember that if you have the reseller admin role, the code determines what that role can do. It is not in a policy file that you can customize.
So reseller admin is basically a catch-all determined for Swift.
Right.
Without it, you can't do anything with Swift.
Oh, OK. So. OK, so he's saying that without that role, you can't do anything in Swift. So you basically have to have this. OK, good. I don't obviously work with Swift a whole lot. So in addition to these two, there may be some other roles that are defined. But these are the ones that I'm aware of. Again, any of these would be qualifying as member. So then you can also create your role, whatever you want that to be. And it could be, for example, you might want to create a role, and this is one of the roles that we created in the product that I work on, a role that can use VMs but can't create or delete them. So like I could stop and start and restart VMs. That's just a couple of basic operations, but I'm not going to let that particular role actually create delete. You could try to create a role that maybe is a project manager that can do some stuff that's a little more advanced than a member, but isn't a full-on admin, and therefore isn't in some ways maybe the main reason for doing that is that this role would not suffer from some of the problems of the admin role if you can define it in a way that you don't hit in those hard-coded checks. Another typical example that we hear about is a read-only role, where you want to create a role that's all they can do is read. Maybe you give it to an auditor or a manager who shouldn't be mucking with things, but they need to be able to see what's going on. The issues with that are, again, things we've already talked about. They're going to be considered a member, so you're going to have to customize more lines of the policy than you might have expected to have to customize. And they're going to suffer from those hard-coded admin checks if you were trying to create a role that can do some of those things. So, as far as selecting which policy rule to actually customize for something, so that can be tricky because you look at Nova's policy file and there's hundreds of things in there. Which one do I actually need to customize in order to let my user create a VM, for instance? So the first thing you could do is look at the description. So it used to be that wasn't an option. We didn't have descriptions for any of these. Now, because of what we were talking about, and Lance showed the example of that documented rule default in the code, now there are, at least for the projects that have implemented that, and like I said, they're trying to do that cross-project in Queens, there will be descriptions associated with every policy that will tell you in some text what it is. And also, there's separate fields that are defined to indicate what API that policy rule is used with. So you can get some good idea of what this policy check is actually going to be used for. So that's great if it's there. If it's not, or maybe even if it is, you might want to check the code to make sure, for instance, that it actually is accurate in telling you what that rule is checked for. Because we're not perfect, and everybody makes mistakes and might have made a mistake there. And then lastly, of course, you could take a guess. They are named fairly intuitively. So They're not named consistently, so the format of the name will be very different from Nova to Keystone, et cetera. But they are, you can get a good idea of what it's probably used for. And that might, for instance, give you an idea of how to search the code if you didn't have a description. Some things to be aware of here is that multiple APIs can be protected with one policy, and it's true in reverse as well. So I could have a policy rule that is used for any access to security groups, for instance. I don't remember if it's security groups or there's one of those. And we've tried to clean up a lot of these different things gradually over the years. And so it will depend, too, on which version of OpenStack you're on as to whether this is an issue for you or not. But I think there's still a couple that are unresolved, where it will apply to not only the same policy rule might apply to read operations as well as create or update and delete operations. In other cases, it might be that you might have the same policy rule for multiple different types of read operations, for instance, a show versus a list operation. In that case, it's probably fine. But if you're trying to create a read-only role and you've got, you run into one of these cases where the same policy check is used for read and writes, that obviously can be a problem. But do be aware that if you change one policy rule, it may affect more than you think it might. It might also affect less if you've got an API that is going to actually check multiple policy rules. For instance, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but Neutron, I think, actually Neutron's a good example where they have multiple policy checks frequently, I think, when you're creating a network. It will say, oh yeah, you'll make this check to see if you can create a network, period, at all. And then it will make another check because in your request, you requested a specific type of network. It will then check that, oh, are you allowed to create that type of network? So be aware of that as well. And then lastly, an API could end up calling other APIs and be subject to the policy checks that are going to happen there as well. So creating a server is a good example. If I try to create a new virtual machine, what Nova calls a server, it's going to obviously run the policy check in Nova. Let's say it passes that. Then it's going to go and try to talk to Glance to get the image. It's going to talk to Neutron to create the network. It's going to talk to Cinder to handle volumes. And all of those calls are going to have associated policy checks as well. So it's not just as simple as going into Nova's policy and allowing the user or the role that you've just created to create servers. You also will have to identify all these other APIs that API is going to call under the covers and customize those as well. So then the last thing I wanted to mention here is that we have this concept of implied roles. So as you can see here, this is the API. And most of the examples that we've put up on the slides have been CLI, not API. That's because there is no CLI for this. It's also not necessarily the best documented thing in OpenStack. However, it's not too complicated. What you've got here is you've got two different roles indicated by the prior role ID and the implies role ID. And what will happen here, maybe it's best to explain this with an example. So if I have let's say a viewer role, a read-only role, that I've gone through and I've customized policy to do all of that, then I could create another role that I want to be able to do all of that plus a few other things. Well, rather than go through the policy files and everywhere I said role viewer, say role viewer and role this other thing, I could instead say that this other thing, give it a name, project manager, implies viewer. So that means that the project manager role will be able to do anything where I've customized policy to say project manager can do it, and anything that viewer can do. So fairly intuitive. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things going forward in the future. We've talked about some of the problems. How are we going to address that, and what are we working on that? And if any of you have feedback on that, it would be great. Also, if any of you have any time to help us with that, we would much appreciate that.
Right. So looking at some of the problems that we have with policy and RBAC management in general, this is essentially a condensed version of the roadmap that we came up with during the PTG. It's a very busy slide. I didn't realize how busy this was until after I wrote it. But first and foremost, we're going to start registering and documenting things in code. This is going to make things easier for operators because you won't have to register all your policies in policy files. Instead, if you're just consuming the defaults, you can get rid of your policy file or just register the ones that you want to override that make sense for your deployment. On top of that, we're going to start adding some improvements to the Oslo policy library. First and foremost is going to be being able to deprecate policies like you'd be able to deprecate configuration options. So as a developer of a project, I want to be able to flag a specific policy for removal like I would with Oslo config, right? And then having that be emitted programmatically to operators. So they can see things come through their log files as warnings saying, yep, this is deprecated. Here's what you need to do in order to accept the new default, or here's what you need to do to accept the old behavior. We traditionally have never had a way to communicate those things to operators. So this is going to start giving us a tool set to make things more well-defined and start breaking things out, making them more granular and consistent. The next big thing that we're going to do within Keystone is implementing something called system scope. In OpenStack today, there's no real difference between things that happen on the system level, and by system meaning like the deployment itself, and the project level. So if I give somebody the admin role on a project, that does not stop them from going and modifying the service catalog or deleting endpoints or deleting a service altogether, right? There's a concept of system scope in that these APIs that are exposed by various services are important to the system itself and don't have any sort of relation to a project. So we're going to start separating those two things out and being able to grant your system administrators access to the system while keeping your customers having role assignments on the projects that they need. And then associating scope to policies. This is going to be an exercise where we kind of go through this together as a community, as a platform of services, where we look at an API and say, does this affect the system? Does this affect resources within a project? So a good example of this would be creating instances. Instances need to belong within a project in order to be billable or whatever. And an example of something that's system-based would be like a service catalog operation or live migration, for example. Like what project would you scope to if you wanted to live migrate an instance off of a host so that you could perform maintenance on it that does not violate multi-tenancy? And then continuing to use service tokens so that we don't trip when we start passing that token behind the scenes to get things done for a specific API call. And then defining default roles in a way that gives us more than just admin and everybody else, like the membership issues that Matt was talking about. We'll have all the tools necessary to start collecting around a set of defaults and then moving toward those as a group of services. And then a couple of tools that we'll have at our disposal that will be more useful than when we've tried to solve this in the past are community goals and project tags. Community goals are already in effect today, and we're using them to help projects move their defaults into code and evolve the policy story that we have. So who does this all benefit? We thought this was an interesting thing that we wanted to include because it still doesn't give us the fine-grained access control over an API that you might see from something like AWS. But it does help us clean up a lot of issues that we have and passing context around and enhancing our policy enforcement in general. So we'll be able to at least collect around a system or a set of default roles and start offering that. And then that gets us closer to being able to enhance that to actual API access that we can modify. So the roadmap that I was talking about is the first link. We've documented that. That was something that we came out of the PTG with. It's kind of documented in a Trello board right now that aligns everything to the release that it's targeted for. And then the second is a feedback Etherpad. So if you have any comments, questions, concerns about the roadmap, and we encourage you to share those with us via that Etherpad, and we can incorporate that into our roadmap. That way we're making sure that what we're doing upstream helps people that have to deal with these problems today. And with that, we do have time for questions. If you do have any questions, just let us know and we can repeat them so that we get them on the recording.
Policy decision point is that just a hallucination? My favorite imagining, so I was kind of surprised not to see it on the
Policy decision point, as in, is that going to be?
It's not really a Keystone thing because it's going into Oslo.
Oslo policies,
Yeah, so-
splitting out to support like Apache Fortress, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's happening. One of the things we should have said here is that we covered a lot of things here, but you can't cover it all. And so there's things like that as well that will come in. That there's definitely work to be done. I mean, you'll notice some of the stuff we didn't talk about on the future slide is addressing some of the issues that I pointed out, like going through some of the projects and cleaning out some of those hard-coded admin checks. That needs to happen too. So there's a lot of different things going on around policy, but yeah, I think that's one that definitely there's people very interested in that.
And in addition to that, there is a spec merge to Oslo policy for the Queen's release to enhance the HTTP check method. But the problem that we're running into is that different services pass different information through that. So we need to kind of fix that too, where we're standardizing that so that people that are passing things to HTTP or Apache Fortress, or if they're rolling their own policy service, they can start relying on something consistently.
So one of the biggest strengths of the policy itself is this fine-grained control. At least something that looks like it might be useful is that when you have ability to map context with the target of your API call. And the way it's implemented in all OpenStack services is through some method, how is it called? The item.
The context, the
No,
Oslo policy module?
the policy model is, anyway, I forgot. But the problem is that this context, and especially the target is only exposed if you have it as a parameter of the method. And in case you don't have parameters, in a case inside the method itself some kind of extra parameters are added into the mix, then it's totally out of the target and you can't do any logic around it.
Yeah, I think that's what Lance was referring to in the inconsistency. So when there was a slide earlier where I showed the context matching the target. So obviously, in order for it to match something from the target, that target information has to be available to Oslo policy, which is doing the check. And Oslo policy should have that because the service, Nova or Cinder, et cetera, when it makes the API call and it's doing that processing and trying to and passes things up to Oslo policy to do the enforcement, it's supposed to pass all this information about the target resource. So if I called an API on a server with UUID 473 blah blah blah, it should pass in the information for that server up to Oslo policy when it's doing the enforcement. And unfortunately, it's very inconsistent in what attributes it's going to provide, whether it provides any at all, because in some cases there may not be any target information. So that's another thing that's going to need to be cleaned up.
All the method parameters because there's it's a decorator who actually does all the work. So you don't know what's in the actual method.
Yeah, and that's different from from service to service, right? Nova will do that differently than Cinder will, et cetera.
But that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's another policy issue. I should take a moment to mention that the roadmap, which is the first link, kind of goes through what we need to do to fix the administ issues.
Yes.
But that also means that there are other things that we need to improve as well, and that's a good example of one of those.
Yeah. And that's one of the things Lance and I were talking about earlier this week, is that there's all these other things that are not on that particular Trello board that we probably need to create other Trello boards or some other way of capturing all these other things that need to be fixed in policy so we can drive those as well.
Obviously, the policy JSON is very complex and cumbersome. Is there or what is being done to validate that the changes you make actually do what are intended and don't have unintended side effects, as well as if you update projects and they start taking out admin role in barcode or permission, accessing code, that actually works as intended?
Sure. The question was, how do we make sure that we're testing this when we go to make these changes, especially if we want to evolve this? There is a project focused on testing RBAC specifically. and we are going to be working that into like our gate. But that'll definitely be a big part of this because we need to make sure that that's there regardless.
That's called patrol,
Yeah.
if anybody's interested. It's also worth noting that we are very careful usually about it changing the policy settings. So if the default was going to change for something, it usually gets a lot of attention. So we will work very hard not to break people.
And policy deprecation will go through the standard deprecation process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be deprecated and then immediately removed. Like we're going to have some sort of cycle to make sure it's communicated to operators.
And as always, it's very good idea to follow the release notes anytime you're going to upgrade to a new release, just to check to see if there's anything in there. But we will, honestly, we'll do our best to make it so that even if you didn't notice the release notes, that you should be okay. We're working on that. So.
To follow up on that on the patrol, in the context of customizing the policy and wanting to test customized policies, is anything being done to ensure that as new policies or new seals are added, that patrol gets coverage for it?
Yeah, we'll need to work directly with the patrol team to make sure that that's covered from the get-go. Like they've been attending our weekly policy meetings, so we have them in the loop on a lot of this kind of stuff.
There's one ambiguous question. Policy, ideally, it would be an API of its own. So, is there any ideas or any kind of roadmaps or blueprints for this kind of thing? So, basically, I want to have an API to into policy.
So kind of going back to Craig's tweet, you mean?
Yeah.
Like, that falls into using HTTP check as kind of the way forward that we see that today. Cleaning up all this stuff and what we had talked about only supplements that. But we have a lot of work to do to clean up the services to make sure that we can actually reliably build on something like that. It's like we can do it. It's just we have a ton of things to clean up first. But yeah, like that should be something you can do. If somebody wants to write their own policy API where they can expose that to their customers and then give the domain admin in their, one of their customers is a domain admin, they can give them access to modify those policies, and then they can start kind of doing things like they would do in AWS, right? But yeah, that's ultimately where we want to go, but we need to crawl before we walk and walk before we run, and we have a lot of things that we need to clean up before we get to that point.
It's understood.
Anything else? All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming, guys. And if you have any more questions, come up to us.